Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another exciting chapter of biblical texts in the context of the ancient Near East. So tonight what we're going to be talking about specifically is the biblical narrative, using ancient Near Eastern law to better understand biblical narrative. I actually learned a lot about this with a professor at the University of Haifa, Meir Milul, and he who does this a lot. He is kind of a bit of an expert in Akkadian law, and he brings it to bear in understanding biblical stories, particularly since they frequently reflect kind of a common law. Now, I do want to, so what we're going to be using, the law codes we're going to be talking about today are the Hammurabi Code and the Middle Assyrian Law Code. I do want to, and for that we're going to be using the source sheets I sent you. I'll say once again that if you are not on my email list, let me know, and I will add you to the email list so you get the handouts. Now I want to say something about how can we use these law codes. First of all, one thing that we need to remember is that when we're talking about very large areas and large distances of time, so even if this were a modern law code where it was the law of the land and people are actually using it to pass them to rule in legal battles, even so, it would not necessarily be the law wherever this story is taking place. That's one on the one hand, and on the other hand, also, these are not modern law codes. The law codes read a lot like Parshat Mishpatim in the Bible. So if you have, if someone does something, then etc. We also have legal transcripts. We have transcripts of rulings from actual law cases. Sometimes these law cases go according to these legal codes. Sometimes they don't. They never cite them. No one ever says, and as in the Code of Hammurabi, this was the ruling. That doesn't happen. Okay. So let's dive into the Code of Hammurabi. Okay. And we're going to start with looking at the Code of Hammurabi, specifically comparing it with the story of Hagar. All right. And the question is going to be, what was supposed to happen, right? What was Sarah expecting and what was playing out when Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham to have kids? And we can figure that out on the basis of biblical stories only, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how one would do that, but also on the basis of what was the common ancient Near Eastern law that they're working according to. What are the expectations? So let's dive right in to the Code of Hammurabi. So here I'm opening, okay, here we go, Code of Hammurabi. Now, if you're reading this, reading what I sent you, I actually highlighted kind of the important laws that we're going to be talking about, but I'm also going to tell you what page we're on. So right now I'm on the first page of the handout. At the very bottom, there's a little introduction about the Code of Hammurabi from Theophile Meek, right, who did the translation. I do want to say that the dating he's using is not the dating that's currently the most accepted one for the Code of Hammurabi. He gives a date of Hammurabi ruling between 1728 and 1686 BCE. We usually use the middle, that's what's called low chronology. We usually use the middle chronology of 1792 to 1750. It's not far off, though. And as he notes, he's saying, oh, this law code is from the second year of my rule, but he talks about things that happened much later, so it's clear that this is not copied. Now, copied in the second year of Hammurabi's rule. It may be a copy of something he did in the second year, but in this final version, it is not. Now, this code is found on a monument. It is currently in the Louvre. I'm going to share my screen briefly so you kind of see what's at the top of this monument. Oh, my video has stopped. I did not mean to do that. Excuse me. Once again, that's why. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And what you see here is the top of the Code of Hammurabi. It's kind of this very large stone monument, and it's written on both sides. So you can see kind of the Akkadian script underneath the picture. The Hammurabi is standing. The person, the character sitting is the god Shamash, who is the sun god and also kind of the god of justice. So you can see he's got a four-horned crown. He's got kind of rays of light or fire coming out from behind him. And he's instrumental in kind of being in the person who's like telling Hammurabi, do this code of justice. Now there's an argument about whether this in fact is just Hammurabi saying, hey, look, I'm doing what you want me to do. Like, this is my code that I came up with, or if this code is somehow supposed to be reflecting something that Shamash wants of Hammurabi. The text underneath it continues also all in the back of the stone as well. So it's a pretty long, extensive text. But it's a monument. It's not meant to be shared, at least what this version that we have is not meant to be shared. It's not meant to be passed around. You can come and look at it and see how just Hammurabi is, but it's not a copy that's meant to be passed around. And this is what we pretty much have of Hammurabi's code. So let's dive in a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit of the prologue. I'm now on the second page of your handout. Okay. When lofty Anum, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth. Now, Anum is the head of the Near Eastern pantheon. And if you remember from last class, you'll be like, wait, but what about El? El is the head of the Ugaritic pantheon. That was Northwest Semitic. That was in kind of north of Canaan, of Canaan. Now we're somewhere else. Now we're in Southeast. The Southeast, we're in by the Tigris and Euphrates. We're actually now in the really in the Fertile Crescent, right? Not far beyond the Fertile Crescent. We're where the important things are happening, right? We're in the center of things now. So when lofty Anum, and their Anum is the head of the pantheon. Lofty Anum and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth. So lofty Anum, king of the Anunnaki, those are the lower gods for Anum. Enlil, he's the head of the Agigi, they're his lower gods, right? The determiner of the destinies of the land. Determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki. Marduk is the patron god of Babylonia, right? So that their big thing is Marduk, okay? So I'm skipping a little. I'm not going to skip actually. Determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, the Enlil functions over all mankind, made him great among the Igigi, made Marduk great among all the lower gods, called Babylon by its exalted name. Babylon, of course, meaning is Bab Elum, the gate of the gods. Made it supreme in the world, established for him in its midst an enduring kingship, whose foundations are as firm as heaven and earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to promote the welfare of the people, me, Hammurabi, the devout, God-fearing prince, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like the sun over the black-headed people. The black-headed people are what kind of the Akkadians call themselves, the Babylonians call themselves, and to light up the land. He is taking on, Hammurabi is taking on the role of Shamash, the sun god, in bringing justice and light to the land. And there is an assumption here that what the gods want is justice. And that is what Hammurabi, the great king, is going to do. Now, by the way, Hammurabi, in fact, was a legendary king. In other words, it's not just that he said, oh, I'm going to bring justice. He was known as this legendary king. He is probably the reason that Nebuchadnezzar, at a time when everyone is speaking Aramaic, is like, no, you write me in Akkadian. You don't just write me in Aramaic. At the time, he had scribes writing in both Aramaic and in Akkadian. Someone wanted to write to him in Aramaic. He said, no, you write to me in Akkadian. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar was what they call the Neo-Babylonian era. He was the new Babylonian king. He wanted to connect himself to Hammurabi, who, of course, wrote in Akkadian. And I'm going to take a pause here because Susan is asking a question. From what locations and times are the court rulings you mentioned? We have court rulings, I think even we have Sumerian court rulings and a lot of Akkadian court rulings. We have them throughout this period and later. We're going to, when we look at the Middle Assyrian, we have rule codes. By the way, Hammurabi is not the first law code. Okay, we have earlier law codes. There's a Sumerian law code. We have earlier law codes in Hammurabi, and we have court cases that go through this period also to much later. Okay, throughout a long period of time. I am a little bit less of I'm not like a particular expert on all the legal documents. Realize that we have a ton of material in Akkadian that hasn't even been kind of decoded. There's just huge amounts of material from this area and this period, and people are much less interested in it than they are, for example, interested in the Bible. So you don't have, there's a lot of stuff that is not as accessible. And frankly, there are volumes of it that I haven't read. I can't say like, oh yeah, the reason I don't know is because it's just not available. There are things that are available that I don't necessarily have at my fingertips, right? I have things at my fingertips that people have cited in parallel to what's going to these codes and to biblical texts. Now, right, so the monument can be interpreted, as Susan mentioned, as either Hammurabi presenting the legal code created to Shamash, or Shamash handing the code to Hammurabi. And in fact, what it looks like is Shamash is holding kind of a scepter almost. It doesn't necessarily seem like he's necessarily holding the code itself. So it could be that he's simply saying, I'm commissioning you to do this. Like, I want you to do this law code. So we have the setup for the Code of Hammurabi, okay? And he ends his prologue. If we go down to the end of the third page of your handout, he says, when Marduk commissioned me to guide the people aright, to direct the land, I established law and justice in the language of the land, thereby promoting the welfare of the people. At that time, I decreed, and then he goes right into the beginning of the law code. So he says, so he gets his commission from Marduk. Marduk is not the god who's on top, right? That's Shamash. But he says, Marduk, who's the god in charge of Babylonia, he commissioned me to guide the people aright. What does that mean, he commissioned me? I'm the king. Why am I the king? Well, Marduk wants me to be the king, otherwise I wouldn't be the king. So Marduk says, you guide the people, so now I establish law and justice, okay? And he starts right off, at that time I decreed, and then if you turn to the next page of your handout, page 4, he starts right off, if a seigneur has made up his mind to divorce a lay priestess who bore him children, etc. Okay, so what's a seigneur? This is also important.
What page are you on now?
I am now on page 4 of the handout, which is page 172 of the book. So okay. If you're looking, right, so I'm at the very beginning. That's where the code, the actual law code starts, okay? Now, I want to say here also something very important to notice about the Code of Hammurabi. It's something that kind of jumps out almost immediately. You see if it says, if a seigneur, the Akkadian word here is awilam. Sumerian has actually a very similar word. Awilam is kind of the highest level person. They're kind of like, it seems like nobility, free man. There's an awilam, then there's a mushkenum. A mushkenum is a guy who is free, he's not a slave. All right, but he is, he's lower than an awilam. Okay, he's probably like more craft, people who were like workers, and then the lowest level is a wardum, is a slave. Okay, so you have these 3 levels of people, and the law is different for each of them. In other words, an awilam gets a different punishment than a mushkenum, and also depending on who they're doing it to. Right? So that's actually a different rule. So if, for example, if we look at the, and also I do want to say just something should know about Akkadian, especially Old Babylonian Akkadian, they have something called the enclitic M or enclitic mem. The ending, the m, is added on just to protect the case ending, which is the u. U is means it's a subject. The is just to protect it. So the actual root of the word would be ward, awil, mushken, right? But we call mushkenum, awilam, wardum. So when we talk about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and people say, oh, is it true that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is in the Code of Hammurabi? And the answer is, well, yes, Yes, if you're talking about people who are on kind of the same level, right? So if you're talking about, if I remember correctly, if an awilam does it to an awilam, then it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But if a awilam does it to a mushkenum, he pays him money. Okay, so you've got different rules. What does that remind us of in the Bible? It reminds us of Vayikra Chaf Daled Chaf Bet. That's Leviticus 24:22, right? So if you look at Vayikra Chaf Daled Chaf Bet, it says, of course, Mishpat echad yelachem kager k'ezrach yeh. You will have one law as the sojourner or stranger, so shall the citizen be. Ki ani Hashem Elokechem, because I am the Lord your God. Okay, so the idea there, we're so used to this idea, well, of course you've all got the same law. Like, how would it work? Now, of course, that's not quite true, right? Frequently, citizens have different laws than people who aren't citizens. Right? There are absolutely cases like that. However, one of the things that's clearly also within the context of is in the ancient Near East, it's very natural for an awilam to have a different law than a mushkenum. And we're not even getting to slaves. Like, these are two free men, but they've got different laws, okay, because of their status. So going back to the Code of Hammurabi, okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to where we get some background for Hagar. Now, if you're looking at this on a computer, you will see it highlighted. Okay, it's on. We're still on the same. We're on page 4 of the handout, which is page 172 of the book, and it says, when a seigneur, an awilam, married a hierogul, that's a priestess. It could be like a kadesha, but she doesn't necessarily. I think she doesn't necessarily have to be a temple prostitute. She could just be some kind of priestess. And she gave a female slave to her husband, and she has then borne children. If later that female slave has claimed equality with her mistress because she bore children, her mistress may not sell her. She may mark her with the slave mark and count her among the slaves. So what is the situation that's being described here? It's much like the situation that we would imagine, except for the priestess part, of Sarah with Hagar. In other words, here she is, you've got a wife. One assumes that there's the reason that she's giving the wife to the husband is for him to have kids, maybe as a gift, I don't know. But she's giving her, and in fact, this slave has children. And the slave, on having children, counts herself equal with her mistress. Okay. Now, clearly a line has been crossed. Now we see this also with Hagar. Hagar gets pregnant, and it says that she starts to kind of lord it over Sarah. Right? It says that. And Sarah starts to torment her. We don't know what the tormenting includes, but we know that she's tormenting her. This is, in fact, a situation that's being described, very similar to the situation being described here, where the woman who has born children, in fact, she can't be sold. So in other words, since she's born children, she's not just a slave anymore. She is the mother of the man's children. So she can't be sold by this woman who, if you recall, owned her, right? The wife owned the slave woman. She gave the slave woman to her husband. In fact, the slave woman had children, right? She can't now sell that slave woman. That slave woman is not just a slave woman. However, she can treat her like a slave in every other respect. If this slave gets uppity, she's like, no, sweetheart, I'm branding you, right? She can treat her like a slave in every other way. Okay, and that's the rule. That's what's being described here in the Code of Hammurabi. And that says if she did not bear children, her mistress may sell her. Okay, so the fact that she's born children, that keeps her from being a total slave. But if she didn't manage to bear children and she was given to the husband, her mistress is still her mistress, and she can sell her on. Now, how does that help us understand the background of the Hagar story? It helps us do two things. First of all, it helps us imagine a law of the land, which absolutely, not just a law of the land, but a culture in which this would happen, which it wouldn't be weird for a wife to say, here's my slave girl, here, take her and have kids with her. And it's also, isn't that strange that the slave woman would then say, aha, I am pregnant. So now I'm claiming equal rights with you. And yet, but she doesn't have equal rights. At the same time, I want to remind you of the actual Hagar story, okay? What does Hagar do when Sarah torments her? What does she do? You can like unmute yourself and yell out if you want. Anyone remember what Hagar does? What does Hagar do?
She run away? I don't know.
She runs away. Thank you, Miriam. Yes, so she runs away. And so she runs away. And it looks like she's going to run away, and she's not planning on going back. At this point, the important thing is the reason she can run away is because she actually hasn't had the kid yet. She's still pregnant, right? So she can just run, right? And she doesn't have to worry about whose kid is it. Because if she'd already had her child, she would have had to abandon him to run away. And now she's pregnant. Like, just to remind you in terms of the story, how come she can consider running away? She's pregnant. She's not like the case here where the child's already born. She can run away. So Sarah, in fact, treats her like a slave, and she runs away. So she's having none of it. Hagar's not accepting it. She's like, no, right? And an angel has to convince her. He's like, no, go back. Be tormented by Sarah, because great things are going to come out of your kid. All right? And that's on the basis of that promise, she goes back to Sarah. Okay? So in other words, she's not accepting what would commonly be accepted. Hagar is not accepting it. Hagar has an unusual amount of agency in Hagar's story. And I say unusual because she's both a woman and a slave. All right? And I think that in biblical stories in general, and this is important when you compare narrative with law, all right? Because in narrative, in biblical narrative, women have a lot of agency that they don't seem to have either in biblical or in ancient Near Eastern law, okay? They have a lot of choice and a lot of action that changes things. So I'll give you an example, Rivka, okay? So we just read the story about Rivka, right? So Yitzchak says, not Yitzchak, the servant, right? The servant's like, okay, so this is, I'm coming, I'm looking for a wife for my master. How about Rivka? And they're like, you know what? Let's ask her. Now, anyone who reads ancient Near Eastern law will be like, what do you mean, let's ask her? You're going to ask the girl? She belongs to her father. She's like a commodity, right? Her father, it's like she's worth money, and it's up to her father to decide what happens to her. But no, they ask her, and she's like, yeah, okay, all right. And then not only that, but, and this was something I only understood this week when I heard it, because I had just been reading the Code of Hammurabi, and I just been reading the Assyrian Law. I believe it's in the Assyrian Law. Now let me go, which you also have. Let me see if I can find it here. I believe I highlighted it for you. I'll tell you the page it's on. Even if it's not highlighted, I should be able to find it. Here we are. This is in the Middle Assyrian Law Code. If you look at the last page of the handout, 10 out of 10, says, if a seigneur that's an awilam wishes to veil his concubine. What does it mean to veil his concubine? It means to turn his concubine into an actual wife. That's what it means to veil her. To put a veil on her means she's not just a concubine, she is a wife. So if he wishes to veil her, he shall have 5 or 6 of his neighbors present and veil her in their presence and say, she is my wife. And so she becomes his wife. Okay, a concubine who is not veiled in the presence of the men, whose husband did not say she is my wife, is not a wife. She is still a concubine. Okay, if a seigneur that is an awilam died and his veiled wife has no sons, the sons of my concubines become legitimate sons, they shall receive a share. So the veiled wife is the real wife. When does Rivka put on a veil? Rivka sees a man, she falls off her camel, she says, who is this guy, right? And his servant says, that's my master. In other words, that's the guy that you promised yourself to. And she puts on a veil, right? She veils herself, right? She puts on the scarf, right? She covers herself with the scarf. What is that? That's Rivka saying, I am now this man's wife. I've seen him now, and this is cool with me. I am now this man's wife. She puts the veil on herself. okay? This is, I think, on the background of these law codes, to me that says she's marrying him, right? Now, you can get away with this in the story, right? I'm not saying that this is the law, right? I'm saying that it's making, there's a stance that Rivka has in her story in general. Throughout the story that involves Rivka has a tremendous amount of agency and action where Yitzchak kind of doesn't, actually. But moving back to Hagar also has this agency. So according to the rules, Sarah can do whatever she wants to Hagar besides selling her. And she does, right? You don't know what she does, but apparently it's enough for Hagar to run away. But Hagar's not having it and she runs away. And the angel says, no, you've got to go back. And there's a whole, and this to me, connects to, because if you just read the biblical story, you're like, okay, what should have happened? What did Sarah expect to happen? Like us normal, nice and normal people, we modern people, we'd be like, well, what did you think was going to happen when Hagar had kids and you didn't have kids? Like, what did you think was going to happen in that scenario? How did you see this playing out, Sarah? Like, what was going to happen? And if you look at the story of Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, you understand what's supposed to happen, right? In terms of the biblical narrative itself, because Bilhah and Zilpah have kids with Yaakov, and immediately Rachel and Leah name them. They're their kids, right? They're like, oh, God has given me, and they have something about how God has granted them another kid, and they name the kid. Bilhah and Zilpah have no power to name that child. That child's not really theirs, even though that child will always be considered kind of connected to them. That child is not really theirs. Really, it belongs to Rachel or Leah, okay? And that's what one assumes is supposed to happen with the Hagar and Ishmael story. That's why who named Ishmael? In the Hagar, the angel actually says his name's going to be Ishmael. And then Abraham names the kid Ishmael. Sarah has nothing to do with this kid, right? Abraham names the kid Ishmael. He thinks he names the kid Ishmael. We, the reader, we, the audience, know that the angel named the kid Ishmael. The angel named the kid Ishmael in his meeting with Hagar. And Hagar afterwards names God, because she doesn't know apparently the name of God. So she actually gives God a name. So Hagar is like running around naming stuff, right? But so it's a contrast. We can understand the biblical narrative better, both on the background of the ancient Near Eastern law. Like, what would this mean to be a slave woman in this situation, right? And how is the biblical story different from this type of law? What is the out that Hagar kind of has, right? Now, by the way, also in terms of abandonment, again, I learned with Meir Malul at Haifa University and the University of Haifa, and he also read the story when Hagar goes out, when Avram sends them. Oh, this is also important. If we look at the Code of Hammurabi, I've mentioned this before. If we go back up in your handout, let me find the exact page. Let's see if I can, here we are. If we go to, it's page 5 of your handout, and it's page 173 of the book. When a seigneur's first wife bore him children, I'm reading paragraph 170. When a seigneur's first wife bore him children, so now Wielam's first wife bore him children, and his female slave also bore him children. If the father during his lifetime has ever said, my children, to the children whom the slave bore him, thus having counted them with the children of the first wife, after the father has gone to his fate, after the father has died, the children of the first wife and the children of the slave shall share equally in the goods of the paternal estate, with the firstborn, the son of the first wife, receiving a preferential share. And then it says, however, if the father during his lifetime has never said, my children, to the children whom the slave bore him, after the father has gone to his fate, the children of the slave may not share in the goods of the paternal estate, along with the children of the first wife. And this explains a little bit. It's not one-to-one. I'm not pretending that's exactly the same, okay? But this explains a little bit about why Sarah says, once Ishmael is born, and Ishmael's with Yitzchak, and he's doing something with Yitzchak which is not okay, right? Sarah says, I don't want this son of a maidservant to inherit with my son. Send her away. Now, why would that make a difference? The answer is because when it's a child of a slave, even if it's his child, he has to acknowledge that child as his son for the son to inherit alongside Yitzchak. So instead of acknowledging him, he sends them away, right? He does the same thing with the children of Keturah, right? At the end of that story, he has another wife, the children of Keturah, he gives them gifts and he sends them away, all right? Because then the idea is only Yitzchak is the heir. There is one heir for Abraham, and that's Yitzchak. So he can give the other one stuff, but he has to send them away. Now, in that story, when he sends Hagar away with Ishmael, he gives them food and water, and they get lost, which is an important point in the story, because the only reason, because how did they run out of water? Did he not give them enough water? No, he gave them enough water, but they got lost, which took them long, so they ran out of water, and then they were going to die, right? And Hagar puts Ishmael in a place where she can't see him, and she goes and to not see him. She doesn't want to see his death. And Miriam Lul connected it to kind of the rules of abandoning children. When one would officially abandon a child, that's also something to do with put them away someplace where you don't see them. Otherwise, they're not officially abandoned. If you're keeping an eye on them, they're never officially abandoned. Now, the idea of an abandoned child is that someone else can come along and adopt them, right? Now, by the way, who doesn't ever take their eyes off a child who is in theory ready for adoption? This is a leading question, but also kind of a little. Miriam and Moshe. Miriam keeps an eye on Moshe, right? Because the child, he's never really abandoned, right? He's never actually really abandoned, right? They're pretending he's abandoned, right? He's kind of abandoned, but not really abandoned, because Miriam is always watching him. Okay, so he's never truly abandoned, but he's considered an abandoned child, and he's pulled from the water. By the way, from documents, from signatures on documents, and also we know that adopted children were frequently given names like saved from the alligator's mouth, things like that. And that was their name, saved from the alligator's mouth, right? And that's what, when Paro's daughter adopts Moshe, she says, Kimea Maya Mishitiyu, because I pulled him from the water, so his name is Moshe. Of course, the name Moshe also means son in Egyptian. So she gives him an Egyptian name, but for a Near Eastern reason. Right, so it's kind of cute. So going back to the Hammurabi's Code. So I have a question from Susan here, from Miriam. And yet Bilhah and Zilpah's children were not treated as less than the others as opposed to Ishmael. Well, Miriam, first of all, the whole idea, what I was saying with Bilhah and Zilpah is that played out the way it was supposed to. In other words, they're considered belonging to Rachel and Leah, because they gave their maidservants to their husband, and then any kids the maidservant has, they can kind of fully adopt right away. They take in, they name it, and now it's theirs. However, they are always kind of considered a little bit lesser. Like, let's face it, right? So they're kind of considered a little lesser in the future, but the fact is that they don't have the distinction because their slave mothers did what they were supposed to do. Namely, they're like, okay, I gave birth a kid, take it and name it because it's kind of yours, because you're the one who made this whole arrangement. Interesting family. I always think that the whole story, that whole narrative, right, in Breshit and Genesis is telling you, you want to have a second wife, go ahead, have a second wife. It's not going to make for a happy home. You're going to get a lot of misery, a lot of unhappiness with this scheme you've got going. It does nothing to hide just how miserable Rachel and Leah are. And with Leah, your heart breaks. Every single kid she has, now he'll love me, now he'll love me. And you're like, oh, sweetheart, he's never going to love you. It's really sad. And it doesn't hide it from you, right? So that's my 2 cents on that whole thing. But yeah, so that's that family. Susan asks, according to the Hammurabi Code, Sarah couldn't sell Hagar away because she had a child. But Avram could send Hagar and the child away. Only the husband father can send away a slave who bore a child, or sending away different than selling. First of all, yes, sending away is very different than selling. Sending away is she's free. You can free her, sure. It's much more of an act of disinheriting. Now, it doesn't read that way. If you're reading it with the Hammurabi Code, it's kind of an act of disinheriting. It's like, here's food, here's water, you go off, take the kid, right? You don't belong to me anymore, all right? But you're free. Free to go. In the biblical narrative, it's harsher. If you're just reading the story in the biblical narrative, it seems very, very harsh. To just send her away with food and water, with the kid, it's pretty hardcore, right? If you're reading in the code, in the context of the Code of Hammurabi, he doesn't owe them anything, right? Because it says if he doesn't acknowledge the Yishmael as his kid, he owes them nothing, right? So he can he's like, you're free now, go ahead, go away. And now I also want to say, again, we're talking about codes that span, years. We're going to talk about the Middle Assyrian Code, which is later. There are distances involved, right? If we're saying Avram's in Canaan, this is Babylonia. You're talking about very far away. I'm not saying that the exact Code of Hammurabi was what everyone was keeping, right? But it does give you kind of an indication of how the winds blew. Also, again, let's go back to the Code of Hammurabi for a second. If we turn to the end of the Code of Hammurabi, which I will tell you what page it is. Give me a second. Yes, it's page 178 of the book. It's page 7 of your handout. Okay, and Hammurabi's explaining how this law code can be used. And he says it's in the bottom of the page where it says reverse 25, and then it's like right above line 10. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come into the presence of the statue of me, the King of Justice, and then read carefully my inscribed stela, and give heed to my precious words, and may my stela make the case clear to him. May he understand his cause. May he set his mind at ease. Hammurabi, the Lord, who is like a real father to the people, bestirred himself for the word of Marduk, his Lord, and secured the triumph of Marduk above and below, thus making glad the heart of Marduk, his Lord. He also ensured prosperity for the people forever, and led the land aright. Let him proclaim this, and let him pray with his whole heart for me in the presence of Marduk, my Lord, and Sarpanit, my lady. Now, okay, so this guy's got a cause. Let him come to see my stela and see how, and it says, in the days to come for all time, let the king who appears in the land observe the words of justice, which I wrote on my stela. Let him not alter the law of the land which I enacted, the ordinances of the land which I prescribed. Let him not rescind my statutes. Now that's nice, but what's missing here? What's missing here is, okay, the oppressed man comes and he finds his case in the law, and now what? Now what's he supposed to do? So you can say, well, he can go and he can kind of note the law, and he can go and argue it in front of the judge, right? But it's not saying anything about judges, right? The judges are, in fact, the ones who are handling. Judges and counsels, they're kind of like these little kind of councils that decide on these things, and they kind of argue. There was an interesting case where there was a priest who was murdered, and they wanted to say it was his wife. They knew who did it, but they also wanted to blame the wife, and there was this kind of argument back and forth. Why, do we blame the wife or not? Then in the end, they also blamed the wife. They all died. But they had these councils. They had these little councils or a judge, and they would judge according to logic and according to kind of the understood law of the land, right? And in fact, there's an argument that Hammurabi wrote his code, more than an argument, that Hammurabi wrote his code based on legal rulings. In other words, he had these legal rulings, and he said, I'm going to write a code that kind of codifies these legal rulings. But in general, what people did was they ruled according to kind of this tradition and common sense and logic. So, you can't take things. So I am this is what we've got. So it's interesting, and it does shed light on the context in which these stories are happening, or being, and also being understood, right? But we can't always just say, oh yeah, well in Hammurabi it says this one word. It doesn't necessarily mean that was the law of the land. We're going to see that a little bit in a little bit when we compare with Middle Assyrian, or when we talk about Middle Assyrian. Okay, yeah.
If something is in the Code of Hammurabi, do we assume that the common practice?
No.
No.
So we don't assume that common practice was that way. We do assume that it does in some way reflect common practice. In other words, again, we absolutely have legal rulings that seem to match the Code of Hammurabi. We have legal rulings that don't. They never cite the Code of Hammurabi. It doesn't work like a modern law.
Okay.
Okay. So, and Danny and Libby Barkai asked, but doesn't Avram acknowledge Ishmael previously? He even circumcises him. Right. Can you go back on acknowledgement once it's done? Isn't sending a woman out alone, especially with a kid, virtually a death sentence at this time? Don't you need to be part of a community to survive? So I would say like this. those are a bunch of questions. So doesn't Avram acknowledge Ishmael previously? Well, he circumcises him along with his whole household. So like everyone gets circumcised. All the men of the household get circumcised. So you could say, well, he's part of the household. All the slaves are getting circumcised. So yeah, he also gets circumcised. However, he does seem to have a relationship with Ishmael. And that's why I say, you don't necessarily have to say that the letter of the law in Hammurabi is what's being applied here, right? I think if you were actually Hammurabi and you look at the story with Ishmael, you're like, he never called him my son. Did he ever call him my son? Like, you don't know, you like, did he though? Right? So it seems like he has to actually acknowledge him as his son, not even just have a relationship, but actually acknowledge him as his son. Like I said, everyone gets circumcised. You could argue that, but also I wouldn't, it's not a hill I would die on, right? Because I don't think that it's necessarily necessary to actually say, this is exactly like the Code of Hammurabi. It isn't. Now, in terms of the death sentence, the assumption of the story is that it's not a death sentence. That's why he gives her enough food and water to get wherever she's going, right? She's from Egypt. Ishmael ends up in Egypt. The fact is, it's not a death sentence. The fact is, it's not a death sentence. Once they have water, they do just fine, right? So it's clearly not supposed to be a death sentence. She goes back to where she knows people, and she takes him with her. She goes back to Egypt, right? So that's apparently what she was supposed to do. And that way she's part of a community. Okay, so so moving right along. So that's a case where we can have the Code of Hammurabi kind of shedding light on the Hagar story. And Joel Ackerman says, I would suppose that Avram would have to acknowledge Ishmael in front of witnesses, which is not clear happened in the story. It does sound that way. It sounds like it's an official declaration. He says, my son in front of other people. It's also possible, you can read it either way. You can say that Ishmael, after Avram would die, he could maybe bring witnesses who heard Avram call him my son, and maybe that would be an argument in a court case. But you can read it either way. It does sound rich. It does sound like a ritual, like a declaration. Okay, so now what about Dinah? What about Dinah? So let's take a look at the story. Okay, so the Dinah story. So the Dinah story, I'm reading from Breshit Lamed Dalet, Genesis 34, from the very beginning of the chapter of the parak. Vatetzei Dinah bat Leah asher yolda leYaakov lirot bivnot aretz. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who was born to Yaakov, went out to see the girls of the land. Now, going out, actually, that we do have, we actually have occasion to talk about the girls going out, right? But also the verb going out, which also has a pretty clear cognate in Akkadian, is in fact sometimes used as almost a synonym for kind of loose behavior, right? So there's a problem with women going out. Now, I'm not so sure that women don't go out. We forget about this. The whole idea of the woman in the window, which we have, of course, in in all sorts of archaeological finds, but also we have in kind of biblical imagery. The woman's in the window because she's in the harem, she's in the women's house, she's inside and looking out. That's why you have the woman in the window. Women don't go out. If you remember in the interaction between Leah and Rachel, when Rachel wants to buy the dudaim, right? She wants to buy what are they called in English?
Terrapin. 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 Terrapin.
Mandrakes. Mandrakes.
Mandrakes.
No,
Right. So she wants to buy, and she keeps on saying, sell me your son's dudaim. Sell me your son. She keeps on calling them your son's dudaim, your son's dudaim. And I'm like, why is she keeping on calling it? And then I realized because, and also, why can't she get her own? I mean, they're in the field, right? Because she can't go out to the field. Reuven is a boy. He goes out to the field. He found some. He brought them back to his mother. Rachel doesn't have a son to give her dudaim, and she can't go out. So she keeps on saying, your son's doing it, your son's doing it, because it's all packaged in that. She doesn't have a son to go out for. She can't go out herself. That's what they represent, not just the possibility of having a child, but also the fact that Leah already has one who can bring her these things. So women don't go out, and here Dinah goes out, or generally are kind of not supposed to go out. She goes out, however, the other girls of the land are also out. Okay, Vayar ota Shechem ben Hamor hachivi nesi haaretz, vayikach ota vayishkaf ota vaya'aneha. And so Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Chivi, sees her. The Hivite sees her. He's the prince of the land. And he takes the son of Hamor, the prince of the land, and he takes her and he sleeps with her and he torments her. Means he took her and he slept with her violently. He raped her. Okay. Vatikbak nafsho b'Dina bat Yaakov, and he essentially he loved Dinah. He's in love with Yahavatara. He loved the girl. Vayidaber alev hanara, and he spoke to the girl's heart. Okay. Vayomer Shechem el Hamor aviv lemor kach li et hayalda hazot lisha. Shechem said to his father Hamor, take this girl for me for a wife. Okay. V'Yaakov shama ki timeh Dinah bito uvanav hayu et mikneo basadeh v'charish Yaakov adoah. And Yaakov heard that he caused the impurity of Dinah, his daughter. Essentially, he deflowered her, right? And his sons were with their cattle in the field, and he was quiet until they came. So Hamor, the father of Shechem, went to Yaakov to speak to him because they're going to arrange a marriage, right? And the sons of Yaakov came from the field when they heard it. And they were upset and they were very angry. Because they did dishonor in Israel to sleep with the daughter of Yaakov, and so it should not be done. So this sort of thing should not be done. My son desired, his soul desires your daughter. Tnuna talo lisha. Give her to him as a wife, and then they're all going to marry each other, and we all know what happens. They circumcise themselves, and then Shimon and Levi go ahead and massacre them, and Yaakov is upset at them, and they say, and this is now I'm reading the final verse. Lamed Daled Lamed Aleph, that's 34:31. Vayomru, and they said, Hachizonah yaset achotenu. Will he make our sister like a prostitute? Okay, that's the story. What's going on here? So, couple things. I do want to say a couple things about the narrative in general. Why do we need to know? Why is it important that? So there's a certain piece of really what seems really extraneous information, which is you've got Shechem raped Dinah. It makes it very clear he raped her. He grabbed her, he raped her. Okay. Then he loved her. All right. And then he spoke to her heart. Now, why is that important information for us? Right? What does it matter that he spoke to her heart? So I just want to put it out there because we don't have a lot of time to talk about the story itself, actually, because we're comparing it with the law. I think that the reason that that's important is because you're actually not supposed to know who to side with at the end of the story. In other words, Yaakov is genuinely upset. He's like, these guys are our neighbors and you just massacred them. Everyone's going to come and attack us. This is just horrible, right? And the brothers are saying, are they going to make her like a prostitute? If we could assume that Dinah has essentially been raped and kidnapped, and she's stuck with Shechem, and she can't get home, right? It's a much more clear-cut ending, right? It's obviously you got to get Dinah back. That's crazy, right? Or I shouldn't say that's crazy because it's a different culture, right? But you say, look, he took her, he raped her, he wasn't allowed to, and now she's stuck with him. No, right? But But he apparently, that's why it's important to say, well, it sounds like he kind of convinced her to stay because he spoke to her heart, right? So it sounds like he kind of convinced her that maybe it wouldn't be so bad to stay with him. Because I think that at the end of the story, it ends on this very strange note where there really isn't a conclusion. I'm going to read the previous verse. Vayomer Yaakov Shimon Levi. And Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi, Achartem oti lahav isheni b'yoshev haaretz. You have, I don't even know the right, you've like completely ruined me to make me stink among the settlers of the land. Baknani ubaprizi, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, I guess. Va'ani metei misbar. And I just a few people. V'nesfu alai v'ikuni. They're going to join against me, and they're going to kill me. V'nishmati ani ubeiti, and I and my household are going to be destroyed. And their answer is vayomru, and they said hachazonaya said hachatenu. Will they make our sister like a prostitute? Now, and then that's it. That's the end of the story, right? Right. The next one is God saying to Yaakov, okay, go up, and that's the end of the story. So the end of the story is we have two statements. One is you just ruined my reputation among everyone in the land. They're going to come, they're going to kill me, which one could assume would actually happen. That's a reasonable assumption. And the other is, how could they do this to our sister? They're making her like a prostitute. And I think you're actually supposed to hear both. You're supposed to hear both arguments at the end. And if you didn't have this thing with, well, maybe Dinah wanted to stay with him at this point. If you didn't have that question, it would be much more clear cut who's right here. So let's go to our law, okay, to our ancient. Now, in this case, we're not talking about the Code of Hammurabi because we're looking at the only law code that we've got that actually talks about an unpromised virgin who is raped. All of the law codes in general do talk about women who have affairs or who are raped, but they're usually either women who are promised to someone or women who are married to someone. Okay, and there's only one law code, which is essentially a kind of a women's law code. It's a law code with laws that concentrate for the most part on women. That doesn't mean it's feminist. Believe me, it's not, as we shall see. But it's a kind of a collection, particularly of laws pertaining to women. It was found. Oops, sorry about that. Hold on. Fix that. Okay. It was found at the palace, at the gate of Tiglath-Pileser I. So these, I think the tablet, these were actually on clay tablets, dated to, I think, 1100 BCE, but the laws themselves are considered to have been earlier. I think he collected the laws and then they're written down in 1100 BCE. Just a pause, Joel Ackerman noted, sounds like Sistra's mother and her women not going out. Yes. Sistra's mother is a woman in the window, right? She's looking out the window waiting for her son to come home. It's a classic kind of image. It's not just an image in poetry and in narrative. It is also an image in say iconography, in things that you find from the ancient Near East. You have the woman in the window, and the idea is the woman is inside. Women are always inside, right? And they're frequently, if you want to, they're frequently, either looking out of a window, or in the case when, Yitzchak and Rivka kind of get caught together, someone's looking in a window at them, right? Because the women are inside. So in the Middle Assyrian law, and on your handout you have it. I added the beginning of it so you can read the little introduction. If you want, it's on page 8 of your handout, which is page 180 of the book. But we're going straight to the page 9 of your handout, which is page 181 of the book. I'm looking at paragraph 12. If as I'm just going to say Awilam, if as an Awilam's wife passed along the street, another Awilam has seized her, saying to her, let me lie with you. I'm just giving you some general, so you're used to kind of how they're talking about with wives. So one Awilam's wife goes along the street, right? And another Awilam seized her, saying to her, let me lie with you, since she would not consent and kept defending herself. But he has taken her by force and lain with her, whether they found him on the Awilam's wife, or witnesses that charged him that he lay with them, they either caught him in the act, or witnesses saw it, they shall put the Awilam to death with no blame attaching to the woman. This is a case as you have the biblical case where it's clear that the woman defended herself, she wasn't a party to it, and so he is killed and nothing happens to her. When an Awilam's wife has left her own house and has visited another Awilam where he is living, now the left her own house is also using the kind of the yatsa cognate. She's gone out. So that also is already hinting that she's kind of to blame here. So she goes from one Awilam's like to the other one's house. If he has lain with her, knowing that she was an Awilam's wife, they shall put the Awilam to death and the woman as well. So they're both killed. And then the next one is if an Awilam has lain with the wife of another Awilam, either in a temple brothel or in the street, knowing that she was an Awilam's wife, they shall treat the adulterer as the Awilam orders his wife to be treated. If he has lain with her without knowing that she was an Awilam's wife, the adulterer is guiltless. The Awilam shall prosecute his wife, treating her as he thinks fit. Now, this is very different from the biblical law, where here it's up to the husband. It's up to the husband what happens to the guy who slept with her, right? Here, it's a case of, it's not clearly only the wife's fault, which in the previous one, it sounds like the wife really went off to do adultery because she went to this other guy's house. In this case, they were in kind of a public area. So did he know, did he not know? If he knew that she's this guy's wife, then it's up to the husband to give them the same punishment, right? And if he didn't know that she was this guy's wife, then he's free to go, and the husband can decide what to do with his wife, which is very different from the biblical law, where the husband doesn't get to decide anything. There's a set ruling. Now, if we go, where's the? Now I don't see the. Hold on just a second. Let me find the virgin rule. Okay, so you'll see the highlighted section. Okay, in the case of an Awilam's daughter, a virgin who was living in her father's house, whose father had not been asked for her in marriage, whose hymen had not been opened since she was not married, and no one had a claim against her father's house. Okay, so this is a woman she's a virgin, she isn't promised to anyone, she isn't married to anyone, she is in her father's house. If an Awilam took the virgin by force and ravished her, either in the middle of the city, or in the open country, or at night in the street, or in a granary, or in a city festival, the father of the virgin shall take the wife of the virgin's ravisher and give her to be ravished. He shall not return her to her husband, but take her. The father may give his daughter who was ravished to a ravisher in marriage. Okay, what's the story here? It's horrible. Okay, I'm going to finish this so that I can just talk to you straight. But okay, he shall not return her to her husband, but take her. The father may give his daughter who was ravished to a ravisher in marriage. So what happens? As a punishment to the guy who raped her, he's going to take the guy's wife and have her raped, right? And also, the guy who raped her, he can force the guy who raped her to marry her. If he has no wife, the ravisher shall give the extra third in silver to her father as the value of a virgin, and her ravisher shall marry her and not cast her off. If the father does not so wish, he shall receive the extra third for the virgin in silver and give his daughter to whom he wishes. If the virgin has given herself to the Awilam shall so swear, and they shall not touch his wife. The seducer shall give the extra third in silver as the value of a virgin, and the father shall treat his daughter as he wishes. So what are the actual consequences of rape? Let's talk about this for a second, okay? Let's talk about what is this actually saying, okay? About what it means to rape a woman. What's the punishment for raping a woman? The punishment for raping a woman is that your wife is raped. That's the punishment. Okay. The punishment of taking virginity, whether by consent or not, is a certain amount of silver. That's the punishment for taking virginity. Okay, that's nothing to do with rape or not. All right. The force is punished by damage to your wife. In other words, you did something by force without permission to this father's woman property. Something will be done by force without permission to your woman property, your wife. All right? And silver, and you have to marry this girl. Okay? Now, this whole thing sounds horrible, right? And it also indicates that it's kind of a free-for-all if a guy's not married. In other words, let's say this is the law. I don't think this is the law. First of all, Middle Assyrian is if we're going to go with the biblical chronology, so the Middle Assyrian Law is later. It's more like is around the time of the monarchy. Early, I don't remember. Yeah, it's around the time of the monarchy, right? So if you want to keep the biblical chronology, then this is earlier than the Middle Assyrian Law, the story of Dinah. Regardless, let's say that's the law. In that case, in fact, there is no punishment for Shem for raping Dinah besides money and marrying her, right? There's no punishment. He's not married. He doesn't seem to be married. Like, he could be married, right? But let's say he's not married. He is not married. So all he owes, right, is the silver and marrying her, right? There's no actual punishment for raping her, okay? And that is, at least as apparently supposed to be the law of the land, right? That's supposed to be the law of the land. If he had a wife, then she would suffer for him doing this to this woman because she's his property. And it's an eye for an eye sort of thing. You hurt this woman without her father's permission. We're going to hurt your wife without your permission. Okay? So the whole thing is pretty horrible, right? It's up to the father whether that he gets the girl or not, right? It's up to the father. The father can make him marry her and never cast her off, or he can marry her to someone else. That's actually kind of similar to biblical law. The idea that you can make the rapist marry the woman who was raped. And for anyone who thinks this is just the ancient law, I've mentioned this to people before, up until like the 50s, this was Italian. I'm not making this up. You can look up the court case that stopped this. It was a common thing in Italy that a man would rape a woman and then marry her, and then she couldn't testify against him. Then she wouldn't testify against him because he had married her, and now she's his wife. And there was a mobster in like a low-level mobster who did this to a young woman in the 50s. And she was like, I'm not going to marry you. And he's like, what do you mean? Now you marry me and then I don't go to jail. She's like, no, I'm not marrying you. And I'm going to testify against you and you're going to go to jail. And everyone was shocked. She had the support of her parents. But it was shocking at the time because this was what everyone assumed was going to happen, was that, okay, now she's going to marry him. And she's like, no, right? So just because it's not like, oh, it's just in ancient times. But certainly in ancient times, this was absolutely something. Okay, you raped her. Well, now he's marrying her. That's it. That's solved, right? And what seems to be happening in our story, okay, is there's an assumption that it doesn't matter that on one hand, you have two basic assumptions that are different. One is it doesn't matter that she was raped, okay? It doesn't matter. She's with Shem now. Shem wants to marry her. Can we just marry her and then move on? It'll be great. And we're treating this like a regular marriage, like we're negotiating for the marriage. The rape is inconsequential, right? And the other situation and it's not clear, is it the situation that it's a rape, or is the problem that it's just deflowering? Because they say, can this woman just sleep with a daughter of Israel? They actually don't. And then at the end, they say, is he going to make her like a prostitute, right? So is the issue for them rape, or the issue simply that this guy slept with our virgin sister, right? And that's not okay. But the issue is but the brothers see a basic problem and a basic moral issue that must be punished. And not just punished on the wives, but punished, and we would not assume. I gotta say that the thing with punishing the wife, that's Middle Assyrian. You don't get that in Hammurabi, as far as I remember. It's not like everyone was busy, having wives raped for their husbands. But we also don't have the case of the virgin in Hammurabi. This is the only place where the case in the Middle Assyrian law is the only place where we have a case where there's a virgin who is raped, a non-promised virgin who's raped, and what happens, right? And so we can understand a little bit better why Shem and Hamor are both like, who rape? What? They're not even talking about it. It doesn't even matter. The whole point is that they're negotiating a marriage now. He comes to him and he says, my son really wants your daughter. Let's talk marriage. He doesn't say, after what my son did. No, that doesn't matter. It's fixed with a marriage. That fixes it, right? And with a negotiation. Whereas the brothers are like, no, there has been a violation here, and there must be an extreme punishment. an extreme punishment as if she were married. If she were married, this guy would die, right? According to ancient Near Eastern law, if she were married, the guy would die. That's the punishment, okay? He took another man's wife. We're treating her, and we're taking this to the highest level, which, by the way, was not what biblical law does. Biblical law does not do this, right? I'm not saying Chazal do. Rabbinic law does take it much farther. But in biblical law, you do have this issue where you say to the rapist, okay, now you have to marry her, right? And take care of her, and pay, right? But they're like, no, there's been a violation here. Are they going to violate her and then act like it's okay? Are they going to make her like a prostitute? We had to stop it. We had to just completely destroy them. Okay, which is presented as a fairly extreme reaction. But you see these two basic understandings that you could understand a little bit better on the background of the Middle Assyrian law, which would seem to say that the law of the land could have supported what Shem and Hamor were doing, and could have made them feel like they're completely in the right. Everything's fine now. Everything is fine, right? As opposed to the brothers who are like, no. Right? And you can also understand what Yaakov is saying. It's like, you have made me stink to everyone else because they're all just acting normal and you guys are like crazy people, right? Which, again, it is extreme what they do, but it's like, what are you doing? We're in a culture here that works a certain way, and they're like, not for us it doesn't, not for Dinah it doesn't. So that's not for our sister, I should say, not for our sister. That's not the way it works. So it's interesting to read these stories on the background of some of these laws and thinking about what are they saying and what's going on and how can these laws shed light on what's happening in these stories and the dynamic of these stories. So that's essentially the class. I'm going to pause now and read your comments and questions. So here we have, okay, I have to go back a little. Danny and Lydia, hi to everyone. So women could not have friends outside their own family. Well, it sounds like from what Dinah going out to see the girls of the land, it sounds like she wants to have friends outside her own family, right? I mean, it gets her into trouble, but it doesn't sound like that's the sort of thing that you could do. But I think that for married women, they would have friends among their own household. I'm not sure. I imagine they would come visit each other, I guess, but I think but I think also people in general work very much in family units. If the sexual relations, and again, there are ancient Eastern texts which talk about kind of girls going out, like, you know, and kind of, it's problematic, but it's something that girls do. So if the sexual relations happened in the house where he lives, she could have screamed for rescue, hence the death penalty similar to Torah law. No, the sexual relations happened, you mean between Dinah and, so that was Susan. Susan, do you mean between Dinah and Shem? Are you talking about the, if between Dinah and Shem, he grabs her and he rapes her. Right?
No, I meant all the way back in those clauses.
Back when we were talking about the married woman who goes to another man's house, which he's not allowed to do. No, he doesn't. He gets killed because he knows that he's sleeping with another man's wife, right? But if he doesn't know, he gets off scot-free. She's the real guilty one in that one. She gets killed. There's no choice there to the husband. The husband doesn't get to decide what happens to her. She's dead.
Right.
She really went off to this other man. She went to his house. Notice in the biblical law, the idea is, was she in a place where there were other people who would have heard her scream? Okay, that's kind of the decision. So if she's out in the field, she could have screamed and no one heard her. But if she's on the street, how did we not hear her scream? Right? How did we not know? Right? Or in some other public place. But if she's going to his house, she's kind of not allowed to do that already. So already there's a problem. Okay. Also, I'm wondering how the political situation in Hammurabi's Babylon compares to Canaan. As far as I understand, this is from the Barkais, as far as I understand, in Canaan, in Abraham's time, you have a bunch of city-states, originally ruled by a council of elders who eventually merged into a single king. There was no separation of powers, so both lawmaker and judge. Okay, so in city-states, in Mesopotamia, you also had these little councils, because you had these little towns where there were these little councils and they're making a decision. Now here we have a situation, with the Dinah story, you have a situation where someone who's very important. Like normally you can't take this guy to trial. There'd be a problem taking this guy to trial because you guys are kind of new immigrants, and he's a really important person, and that's why it's important to know that he's in the city. Besides the fact that gets his whole city kind of on board, but it's not so easy to punish someone who's a prince, right? You can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to take you to trial and I'm going to win," right? It's kind of, that's why there's no going to court here. But yeah, there are absolutely court cases where you can see even within an empire, because it's this little city and they have just regular people sitting in judgment. Like that, when I mentioned that priest who died and they ended up kind of convicting the guys who murdered him and his wife, right? And there was a bunch of kind of different tradesmen who were kind of sitting together and just making this decision. And they were kind of the council. So you have different, so Hammurabi's Code could be something, a basic line for what the king as lawmaker should do. It could absolutely be, that's the way he's presenting it. Hammurabi's presenting it as, next king, do this, like I did it, right? Exactly how you would, but the problem is that it's the judges who are judging. Like these little judges in these little towns who are actually doing the judging and doing the lawmaking, as opposed to the king. It's interesting that, at least biblically, the king, when do you bring a case to the king? You bring a case to the king when the law of the land is going to lead to an injustice, right? So like you have the case, we have the fake, was it the woman from Tekoa, right? Who she's like, it's a fake case, but she's like, I had 2 sons, one killed the other. Now they want to kill the murderer, but then I won't have any sons. That's when you go to a king, right? When you're like, look, I understand this is the law of the land, but the law of the land is going to lead to something unjust here. Either because there are extenuating circumstances or because that's the way it's working. That's when you go to the king. In biblically, that's when you take a case to the king, when the law of the land is going to lead to an actual injustice. And continuing on, okay, from Joel Ackerman, if the Assyrian law, paragraph 13, had been in effect in ancient Israel, then both King David and Bathsheba should have been executed, except that you don't execute a king. Let's face it, right? None of these laws are pertaining to the king, right? You have different laws for Wheeler and Canaan, and we got very different laws for a king. And the whole point of David and Bathsheba is he's doing everything in secret. The whole point of David and Bathsheba is that he's doing things to cover it up, right? He's not doing anything in the open. It's all a secret. He sleeps with her in secret. He tries to cover it up. He does cover it up, right? And then he marries her, which he's not supposed to do, right? Like he does, it's a one huge cover up. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the big, that's what causes the punishment to David from his own house, because of the tremendous corruption there. We don't hear from Dinah. Maybe she was willing to stay with Shechem and violence would not be necessary, just payment, right? Maybe Dinah was really going out on her own and the brothers objected to her autonomy. Yeah, Dinah, as opposed to everyone else, not everyone else. Dinah does not have a voice. She has no voice whatsoever in what you could consider her story. She doesn't have a voice. She's very much an object. And she's very much the way women are seen in these court cases, by the way. Like she's her brother's sister. She's the object of desire for Shechem, right? She's her father's daughter, right? Because her father can marry her off, right? She does not have a lot. The only action she really does on her own is she goes out to the girls of the land. That's her kind of last action on her own. We have no idea. But the idea that he speaks Elev Hanara, to the heart of the girl, it does indicate that he managed to convince her. That's what it implies, but while keeping her completely passive. True. Completely passive and completely silent. And that also allows for that ambiguity in the story, because you have no idea what she wants, right? No, I think that if she had said what she wanted, it would be important to the story. Since she is silent, her desires are not even discussed, except in that one passage. Is the brothers' reaction to the rape of Dinah part of the general portrayal of the culture of Canaan as inferior, which is why they go elsewhere for wives for Yitzchak and Yaakov? I do think so. I think there is this idea that we are, you wouldn't do that in Israel. In Israel, it's not okay. These guys, sure, Canaan, yeah, they do that stuff. to do that to us would make our sister like a prostitute. I do think that there is that distinction. It's good to be the king, always good to be the king. Also, Shimon, Levi, and Dinah are all children of Leah, whom Yaakov wasn't particularly close to. Could it be that for Shimon and Levi, kinship is more important, and for Yaakov, the politics is more important? I think it's very clear the politics are very important to Yaakov. Like Yaakov has a long, and he also, it's a little weird that when he says, I and my household will be destroyed, you're talking to your two sons. Why aren't you saying all of us would be destroyed? Why aren't you saying if you got everyone angry, they're going to come, they're going to kill us, they're going to kill all of us? And that's what he's saying. They're going to kill me and my household. Part of that is him being really angry, I think. There is this difficulty between him and Shimon and Levi that continues on after they do this, right? He curses them, right? He curses them that they're not going to get a portion in the land of Israel. And of course, neither of them do, but for different reasons. Levi doesn't because he gets to be close to God and he serves in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, whereas Shimon does it because he makes the mistake of conquering with Yehuda. Don't conquer with Yehuda, Shimon. Yehuda's going to get it all. And that's what happens. So Shimon doesn't get his portion. Levi doesn't get his portion as per Yaakov's curse, right? But for completely different reasons. So Yaakov is very politically minded, and he's fairly calculating throughout his story, right? He absolutely has a personality, even though he absolutely develops, but part of his personality is kind of this constant calculation of what's the best thing to do in this situation. What's the best thing to do for me? What's the best thing to do for my household? Where it's very clear that Shimon and Levi here are acting emotionally and with fervor, and it's something that he calls them on later. I don't know how much of it has to do, and obviously Dinah is their 100% sister, right? Dinah they're kind of taking a protective stance towards Dinah. She is Leah's daughter. She is their sister. Certainly, if we want to compare it with stories related to David, we have that situation with Avshalom, Amnon, and Tamar, where Amnon rapes Tamar. Tamar is Avshalom's full sister, right? Amnon and Tamar, half brother, half sister. Tamar and Avshalom are full brother and sister. Avshalom absolutely considers Tamar his responsibility, his to protect and his to avenge against Amnon, who is the crown prince, right? Amnon is the oldest. He's the one who's going to inherit. And Avshalom takes Tamar and he's like, I'm going to avenge this against Amnon. But in that case, by the way, if we compare the two rape stories, in the case of Amnon, it's very clear that Amnon is pretty much evil because he rapes her. She argues with him. She has a voice. She argues with him. It's very clear she doesn't want it. He rapes her. And then as opposed to Shem, who falls in love with her after he rapes her, Amnon hates her after he rapes her and throws her out, despite her pleading and saying, now you're even worse. And it's very, very clear who we're supposed to see as the villain in that story, right? And who we're supposed to be, kind of rooting for later when Amnon gets it. So I just kind of went off into that. From Yaakov is correct that his whole household could have been destroyed, absolutely. Back in that time, revenge against an entire family for the act of one person wasn't uncommon. A lot of that happened in ancient Scandinavia. A lot of that happened with Eskimos in the 20s. I love talking about Eskimos. But yeah, so what I'm saying is that even in much more modern context, you absolutely have this idea that taking revenge on an entire family. And in this case, it wouldn't even be taking revenge. If you've got a family with people who are so off the wall that they just wiped out a city, right? What would you think if you had these two brothers and they wiped out a city and you're another city next door? What are you thinking should be done about this family? Like just like normally, like what would you say you should do with this family? Would you be like, yeah, these are great neighbors. They only killed off that city, right? It's a natural thing for him to think that there's going to be serious repercussions, even if there aren't. It may very well still happen in Bedouin society, as the Barkai say. I'm less familiar with that than I am about They were about Eskimos in the 20s. Because I have my priorities. What do you read about? Anyway, so I hope everyone enjoyed that. I thought that it's nice to actually see what light can be shed on actual stories, biblical stories, from looking at ancient Near Eastern law. And so have a good night, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. And this will be up on both Facebook and YouTube. If you want to know about the YouTube videos going up as soon as they go up, so please subscribe to the channel, and then you'll get an alert on YouTube when as soon as the video is up. The channel is just my name, Miriam Brand, with Miriam, so you can find it pretty easily, and and only you, because no one else is looking for it. So take care, everyone.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thanks, Miriam. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.
See you next week.
Okay, see you next week. Bye-bye.